Apart from political conquest, the wars of colonization in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia had a clear economic motive as well. Appropriation of wealth, both through plunder and also through the monopolization of trade. Plunder, the first of these classic mechanisms of colonial wealth extraction, is something that's largely ignored today by the economics profession. Neoclassical economists tend to assume this away when they start in building their models from assumptions as to the initial endowment of resources. Marxists tend to see plunder as something that happened in a bygone era, in the era of so-called primitive accumulation or initial accumulation of capital. But plunder's not as absent from the world economy today as it is from most of our economic textbooks. In fact, it still is a very important phenomenon and one that's particularly important in understanding the dynamics of war and peace building. During the colonial era, within Europe itself, the rule of law gradually took hold as the norm governing economic behavior. Outright theft of property was, if not abolished, at least it was frowned upon and legally sanctioned. But those rules applied to economic intercourse within the newly forming European states. But when it came to the colonies, those rules were tossed out the window. The scruples and constraints against plunder no longer mattered when it came to dealing with other peoples outside of Europe. For example, we have the chattel slave trade, enslaving Africans and transporting millions of them across the Atlantic, a form of outright plunder in which the wealth being extracted was human beings and their labor power. We have the exploitation of Native American labor in the mines of Spanish America, the expropriation of Native American lands in what became the United States. In all these ways, plunder was the rule rather than the exception during the period of colonization. The second important mechanism for wealth accumulation in the colonial era was the monopolization of trade. In this case, not through the outright seizure of resources, though of course that was going on at the same time, but instead through the control over the choke points through which those resources pass, the choke points of international commerce and trade. And that monopolization phenomenon was exemplified by the rule of the English East India Company in South Asia and the Dutch East India Company in what is now Indonesia. That too is something that has not disappeared from modern economies, and control over choke points remains a particularly lucrative way in which wealth is accumulated today, something that doesn't fit into the models of a free market, but certainly fits in to what really happens all around us, and again, can be particularly important in understanding the dynamics of war and peace. The wars of conquest were followed in due course by wars of independence from colonial rule. But plunder and monopolization remain common, even ubiquitous features of many societies, and both flourish, particularly in war economies. Turning to the big wars of the 20th century, apart from the wars of decolonization, World War I involved fighting not only in Europe, but also in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. And indeed, competition over control of colonies is often seen as one of the sources of the inter-European rivalries that precipitated that war. The death toll was enormous. It's estimated at 9 million combatants and another 5 million civilians. And that doesn't count related events like the Armenian genocide that killed 1 million people, or the outbreak of Spanish flu towards the end of the war that killed somewhere between 17 and 50 million and maybe more. The Treaty of Versailles at the end of the war, following the military defeat of Germany, imposed massive penalties on the loser, on Germany. Reparation payments that would be equivalent to about $400 billion in today's money. That decision was opposed by some people, including most famously the economist John Maynard Keynes, who wrote in his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was about the end of World War I, that this could prove to be a disastrous mistake. Keynes, who attended the Paris Peace Conference as a representative of the British Treasury, opposed the reparations on the grounds that they would crush the German economy and thereby destabilize not only that country, but Europe as a whole. The subsequent rise of Hitler, setting the stage for World War II, confirmed his worst fears. Barely 2 decades after the Treaty of Versailles, war broke out again in Europe. And this time the fatalities are estimated at between 70 and 85 million people who lost their lives in that conflict. In a striking difference from World War I, instead of crippling reparations, the victorious Allies at the conclusion of the war, led by the United States, instituted a large-scale reconstruction program that included large-scale economic assistance to the defeated powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, as well as to the other countries that had been severely damaged during the war. And in doing so, they took Keynes's verdict on Versailles to heart. Instead of reparations, they provided aid. This, I would say, is one of the all too rare instances in which the advice of economists was both good advice and it was followed by policymakers. There was a debate at the time whether the Marshall Plan, as the European component of that economic recovery program was called, would be delivered in the form of grants that did not have to be repaid, or loans which would have to be repaid. This was a major debate among U.S. economists at the time. The Marshall Plan is widely credited with having laid the foundations not only for the economic recovery of Europe, but also for European integration in the post-war era, helping to head off the specter of yet another Europe-wide war so far. In the end, the vast majority of the Marshall Plan assistance was provided in the form of outright grants, not in the form of loans. Why did the U.S. decide to do this? Well, if you go back and read the debates at the time, you realize that there was a compelling reason for this largesse, an economic reason that was in the interests of the U.S. as well as of the recipient countries. One was, of course, not to saddle these countries with debt burdens, which in turn could turn out to be difficult or even crippling burdens for their economy. But the other was the understanding at the time that if the money had been provided in the form of loans, which had to be repaid, the repayment of those loans, the foreign exchange coming back into the U.S. economy, would require the countries doing the paying to run trade surpluses with the United States. That is to say, money coming into the country would be deficits on our trade account, on the U.S. trade account, and that would endanger the full employment goals, which were foremost in the mind of many U.S. economic policymakers and politicians alike at the end of the war. So the money was provided as grants. U.S. administrators of that grant money were given what one economist writing at the time in the American Economic Review called vast power of allocating and withholding money to ensure compliance with the conditions that went with that large-scale grant assistance. This was not money given with no strings attached. It was given with strings, and those strings were enforced by the administrators of the aid program. So among the take-home lessons from that experience at the end of World War II are first that debt has perils, both for borrowers and for lenders alike, that we should be very careful when we include the accumulation of debt as part of the normal course of economic affairs, and particularly in the sensitive periods following war and conflict. A second take-home lesson is that conditionality, conditions applied to the delivery of external assistance, are a common and indeed, in many respects, inherent feature of post-conflict aid. If you think about that aid for peace bargain, the bargain is a two-way bargain where the aid is provided in return for steps to consolidate the peace. And that was certainly true at the end of World War II. The war came to an end and unleashed a number of important changes in the world economy. Among the most important were the land reforms that took hold across East Asia and helped to put in place the political and economic foundations for what became known as the East Asian miracle, the rapid growth of the economies of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China. Land reform broke the back of the old landowning oligarchy and allowed for states to emerge that were more committed to broad-based economic growth and development rather than to the preservation of the wealth and privileges of a narrow landholding elite. And those land reforms happened in very different ways in different countries. So in the case of Japan, for example, the land reforms were implemented by the US military occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur at the end of the war. In China, they were implemented by the Chinese Communist Party as a result of the Chinese Revolution, led by Mao Zedong. MacArthur and Mao don't have a lot in common, but one thing they do have in common is that by pushing forward land reforms, they helped set the stage for the development of East Asia in the post-war period, arguably the most successful economic development that we've seen since that time. Another thing that happened at the end of the war was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States. That not only concluded the war was on the verge of ending in any case, but also those bombings were the opening shots of the Cold War. The bombing at the time was opposed by many top US leaders, including military leaders, who were thinking really about drawing World War II to a close rather than about commencing a new conflict with the Soviet Union. So General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as the Supreme Commander of US Allied forces in Europe and will go on soon to serve 2 terms as President of the United States, voiced what he called grave misgivings to the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, saying that Japan was already defeated and that the dropping of the bomb was, in Eisenhower's words, completely unnecessary. Similarly, Admiral William Leahy, who chaired the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the United States military during the war, wrote in his biography, "The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted the ethical standards common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion," Leahy said, "and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children." Unfortunately, those early warnings were not listened to. The bombs were dropped, and this period of nuclear confrontation was begun. 2 important consequences of the decision to embark on the Cold War were the growth of a permanent arms industry, absorbing enormous resources both in the US and the USSR, and in a number of other countries as well, and the proxy wars fought in the former colonies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia between the superpowers. Eisenhower was very much aware of the growth of the permanent arms industry. And in his farewell speech in 1961, he said,
"Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions." Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
And that phrase used by Eisenhower, the military-industrial complex, is one that then percolated into common vocabulary and became an almost taken for granted feature of the economy today. The other big feature of this period were the proxy wars in the global south. The wars in Central America, in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, which pitted revolutionary guerrilla movements against dictatorial military regimes supported by the United States in the name of fighting communism. Similarly, in Angola, in sub-Saharan Africa, a long and deadly war took place, a war for Angola's independence from Portugal, and then between opposing parties on the Angolan side itself, a war which was supported both by the US and by the USSR on different sides in the name of pursuing their Cold War rivalry. Vietnam, perhaps most famously, was the Cold War proxy war in which the US spent enormous lives, both of young soldiers, men of my generation as it happens, and even more so Vietnamese who were killed in the conflict, millions of them. Ultimately, of course, the US lost that war. When I went to Vietnam a few years ago and saw that country and saw how generous the Vietnamese were in welcoming me, I realized that all of that cost that we bore and inflicted in that war were completely, terribly wasted, worse than wasted. They caused tremendous suffering for many people here and, above all, in Vietnam. That was a proxy war, fought in the name of containing communism. The Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan and the US support for the Mujahideen who fought the Soviets in Afghanistan was one of the closing proxy wars of the Cold War. And again, it had enormous consequences, above all for the people of Afghanistan, but also for the entire world, as we subsequently learned. These wars not only had terrible impacts on the countries where they were fought, but also debilitating impacts on the economies of the US and the USSR. In the case of the United States, the expenditures on the Vietnam War had enormous consequences. The mental and physical wounds that survivors came back with and the costs of treating them or failing to treat them. There were also the huge financial costs of the war, the debt that the country accumulated, which included foreign debt, borrowing from abroad, the counterpart of which, again, of those inflows of money on the capital account, were trade deficits, which have continued and indeed grew in the US economy in the wake of the war and are today a common, indeed taken for granted feature of how the US economy runs. So these were fallout from those proxy wars. And the take-home lessons, I would say, from those experiences of the 20th century are first that while war brings suffering to many people, it also brings profits to some people. Not only to the people selling the arms, but also to some of the people directly involved in pursuing the conflict. And this is something we'll see again and again when we turn to the dynamics of civil wars. The second major take-home lesson is that international backers are often deeply involved in so-called civil wars. And by implication, therefore, international parties must be deeply involved in their resolution and in building a lasting peace.